Yeah. Welcome to October. We're still getting sunburned. So hello, everyone, and welcome. We've got folks joining us through Zoom, as well as folks joining us through Facebook Live. We'll give people another couple minutes to come in. In the meantime, some quick husbandry to go over before we start. Welcome to the Discovery Speaker Series put on by the Puget Sound Estuarium. We host these virtual presentations every first Thursday of the month, starting in October. So welcome to the first one of the year, going until next March. And so we'll have lots of different speakers for you to hear and for you to interact with. And so we'll have a 45-minute presentation, and then we'll have 15 minutes at the end for question and answers. If you are joining us via Zoom, you can comment in the Q&A any questions that you have throughout the presentation, and we'll get to those at the end. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, feel free to put your questions in the comments below, and we'll get those questions sent to us so that we can still answer your questions as well. We also have a fun, free coloring page for you to download that goes along with our talk today. This drawing was done by one of our volunteers, Shane, and so you should pick it up. It's a pretty cool drawing. I'll probably be working on this one throughout the talk. And then if you have to leave early and can't stay for the entire talk, this will be up on Facebook for right after this talk ends. And then we will also be posting it on our YouTube channel afterwards, once we make it all pretty. And so if you follow us on YouTube, you will get that notification that we posted this video, and you can share it with friends or family, or rewatch it because it's going to be great, right? And so thank you all for joining our first Discovery Speaker Series of this season. My name's Clarissa. I'm the Program and Volunteer Coordinator at the Estuarium, and it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Alexandrea Safiq. She is a ecologist and evolutionary biologist, and she is currently going back for more school after getting a doctorate for her postdoc at University of Minnesota. Her work focuses on conservation psychology, ecosystem-based management, and wildlife protection. And today she'll be talking about her recent study on nature-based spirituality in regards to our chinook salmon and our resident orcas here. And so I want to give a huge thank you to Dr. Safiq for being our first speaker of this season, and we are so excited to have you. So whenever you're ready, you can get started with your presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Clarissa. And I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for hosting me. Thank you to the Puget Sound Estuarium, and hi, everyone. So let me go ahead and share my screen here and get the talk up. Okay. Can you see me? Give me a thumbs up if you can. Perfect. All right. I'm just going to go ahead and go to slideshow. And we're off and rolling. All right, I'm going to move my picture over here so I can see my own slides. Okay, fabulous. So welcome, thank you for attending. I will be talking about my recent survey looking at nature-based spirituality, value orientations, and how that may influence engagement with conservation-based behaviors in the context of Chinook salmon conservation and also resident orca conservation here in the Puget Sound. And so here's a brief little introduction to who I am, although Clarissa already did a beautiful job of that. In 2019, I started my postdoctoral research associate position in the Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology Department at the University of Minnesota, where most of my work focuses on conservation psychology and environmental justice work in the context of doing ecosystem-based management and wildlife protection. Prior to that, I completed my PhD in ecology and evolution at Rutgers University, which is in New Brunswick, New Jersey, for those of you who may have spent some time out there or are familiar with the school. Lovely area. And before that, I completed my undergraduate degree in environmental science and astronomy from Union College, which is in upstate New York, or if you're actually from upstate New York, then you'll realize that it's actually kind of the capital region. It's about 20 minutes outside of Albany, but it's often touted as being the beginning of the upstate New York area. And then also, just for some fun, and to show that I'm a multi-dimensional human being and not just a scientist, here are some of the things that make me really happy. So I was born and raised in Western Washington, and I love it out here. Actually, being out here and being raised out here is why I ultimately ended up pursuing environmental science and ecology, love for the landscape and for the animals that live in it. And I am also a member on the Olympia Parks and Recreation Advisory Committee, which if you are an Olympia resident and you would like to get more involved in parks and recreation or like to stay updated on what's happening in our parks, those meetings happen once a month and you can find them on the City of Olympia webpage and calendar, and they're open to the public. So just a quick little blurb about that. It's a wonderful opportunity to engage in local parks and rec. And then outside of that, I love to knit, which is fabulous. A lot of really great knitting places out here in downtown Olympia. And then I also have a wonderful 3-year-old kitty. His name is Mr. Perfect. He's really great. He also enjoys knitting, although he likes playing with the yarn as opposed to actually creating anything useful. And then I also host a book club in downtown Olympia, which I'm happy to talk about later with folks if you're curious. I have my email up here if you have any questions about my research or about the topics, feel free to email me there. I also have a Twitter that I'm trying to get more engaged with. So if you're on Twitter and you'd like to follow, please go ahead and do so. All right, so on the agenda today, that seems like a lot, but I think it will be more of a storytelling session than a formal deep dive into the science, but just so you're aware of where we're going and our trajectory here. I'll give a brief background on resident orca and Chinook salmon and their conservation status and story here in the Puget Sound. And then I'll jump into conservation psychology, what it is, give a couple of definitions so you're well prepared to go into the background of my research, as well as the methods for the survey that I'm working on or have worked on and completed and now am analyzing the outcomes of those data. And then we'll wrap up with some implications of the results of my survey and potentially what it could mean for conservation and management. And then we'll open it up to the public for questions. All right, so starting off with the story of the resident orca here in Puget Sound. So resident orca are very interesting culturally and ecologically. ecologically speaking, resident orca have existed in the Puget Sound for many millennia, and they have co-evolved with the other species and the landscapes to have very unique behaviors and very unique genetics specific to the region. And so part of this uniqueness is that resident orca are the salmon-eating orca. So not to be confused with the transient orca, or sometimes called Biggs orca, that migrate from Alaska down into our waters, sometimes passing through, mostly to eat pinnipeds or marine mammals. Our orca here in the Puget Sound exclusively eat salmonoids, with chinook composing the majority of their diet, which is really interesting. Also, if you're familiar with orca behavior, orcas are very intelligent beings. They have very interesting social structure where a lot of their hunting techniques are actually passed through the matriline of their pods or their family groups. And so if you took an orca from the Puget Sound and you put them in different waters with other orcas, they actually probably wouldn't be able to communicate very well. And the reason is because they actually have specific dialects, very similar to humans. And that too is influenced by their generational kind of cultural inheritance from their pods, flowing primarily through their matriline, their mothers. And so in the Puget Sound, resident orca are usually identified by three groups named from NOAA as J-pod, K-pod, and L-pod. And they historically have faced a lot of conservation challenges. So their populations were once in the mid-hundreds, but due to primarily anthropogenic factors, their populations have unfortunately declined to the low 70s. I believe 73 is the most recent official number. And some of those causes would be from back in the 80s and 90s, where resident orcas were actually captured and shipped around the United States for amusement parks, and that contributed significantly to their population decline. And actually here you'll see a photograph of a resident orca performing at Miami Seaquarium. This is Tokate, or colonially known as Lolita. She is the last living wild captured orca, and she came from the Puget Sound. And there's a lot of really great work, primarily led by the indigenous groups of our region, to bring Tokate back home into a marine sanctuary work. And I'm happy to talk about that in the questions if folks are interested, but bring it back around to say that the captivity of orca contributed to their population decline. Also contributing to their population decline is a history of dwindling prey availability. So I mentioned earlier that our orca primarily eat chinook, and the chinook salmon population has taken a significant hit in their population numbers and their population structures, which I'll talk about in just a second. So we have fewer prey, fewer whales in the Sound, and of the orca that are left in the Sound and of the prey items that are available to be eaten by those orca, unfortunately, many contaminants from the runoff from urbanization and buildings and mercury just buildup tends to accumulate in our orca, and that has contributed also to the early mortality of orca. They usually have about the same lifespan as humans, about 80 80 years, 75 years, around that mark. But because what happens, I'll try to explain briefly the concept of bioaccumulation, which you can see in this figure here. You have small primary producers here, phytoplankton, that absorb a very small amount of contaminants. Those primary producers are then consumed by slightly larger predators. Here they would be zooplankton. As those zooplankton eat more of the primary producers, the concentration of contaminants gets larger in those smaller prey items. Those smaller prey items that now have a slightly larger load of contaminants are eaten by fish. Those fish, like herring, that are kind of small, end up being prey items for a lot of salmonoids and chinook. And so you get this bioaccumulation of contaminants. And so by the time a resident orca eats the chinook salmon, they're actually consuming a higher concentration of contaminants from the local environment. And historically, this has been a problem because when there were enough salmon to sustain larger population numbers, orcas would deposit the fat that they were getting from chinook salmon into their fat deposits. But as the population of salmon declined and orca started tapping into their fat reserves, a lot of those stored contaminants started entering their bloodstream and their system through the fat deposits that they had stored. And then they started falling sick, and some of them eventually dying. And so that's the short story of how bioaccumulation has affected orca and contribute to their decline. And then lastly, they also struggled with noise from fishing vessels or from marine vessels. And a lot of people, they certainly are influenced by the noise of like individual boats, but the primary and most lethal or immediately lethal object kind of in the ocean would be these larger sonar vessels that emit this noise and ends up sometimes damaging the eardrum of the orca that use sound to locate prey items and to talk with one another. It can be very disorienting for them, and ends up negatively influencing their ability to successfully secure prey items. And so we want to mitigate that as much as possible. Now, with all of that said, I don't want to leave this on a doom and gloom note. NOAA and many other wonderful state and federal agencies and local organizations have worked very, very hard over the decades to make sure that orca have the best possible chance in the future for recovering. And so I want to give a nod to that. Here's a image of the webpage from NOAA Fisheries. You can type this into your web browser and it will pull up this awesome page where you can read through the orca recovery plan. And it even goes into their connectivity with salmon, and you can read about the salmon recovery plan. Which brings me to salmon. So like I said, when you talk about resident orca, you can't not talk about salmon, chinook salmon. And so salmon face similar conservation challenges. They have dwindled in population sizes, in part due to contamination, but mostly from removal of viable habitat, especially habitat along the Columbia and along the Snake River. And so there are a lot of really wonderful organizations and people working very hard to advocate for the removal of dams along the lower Snake River to restore salmon habitat. And just to quickly nod that salmon are incredibly resilient species. There's a study, I'm forgetting the names of the authors at the moment, but if you go to Google Scholar and you type in salmon, habitat recovery and restoration, you'll probably find a paper that says that even after several decades of salmon not having access to their ancestral natal streams, that when those habitats do have a chance to recover, they actually come back. And so this effort to restore habitat along the Lower Snake and along the Columbia is ultimately a very good forward-thinking initiative. And I hope that that continues for our state. And so again, just want to give a nod that this isn't entirely all doom and gloom, but it's good to have the context. Again, NOAA has done incredible work over the years, and so have other state agencies. NOAA is a federal agency, but there's also been state agencies who have worked tirelessly to get salmon the habitat that they need, and also to make sure that their habitat sustains larger population sizes, which are also supplemented by fish hatcheries. And so with that context, I keep that in mind for the context of the study because those are our focal species. I'll give a brief introduction into what conservation psychology is. So psychology is the scientific study of the mind and behavior. When we add conservation as a subfield of psychology, we're talking about the use of psychological techniques to understand and promote a healthy relationship between humans and the natural environment, and also between humans and wildlife as well. So in conservation psychology, there are some tenets that I want you to be aware of in the context of my research study. So what makes my research study kind of possible and really interesting is this idea of values. And so what is a value? A value in the context of conservation psychology is an enduring belief that a specific mode of conduct or an end state of existence is personally or socially preferable. And so values ultimately end up informing the choices that we make and the behaviors that we choose, whether consciously or subconsciously, to engage in. The function of values, or how they manifest, like I said, it can inform your behavior or one's behavior of an individual or a collective. And it can also give insight into people's perception of a situation or of an object. And it can also influence how we interpret information that's given to us by our immediate environment. And so values, when you look at them as a system, can give a lot of really great insight into higher order cognitions. Now, when you have a single value, that can be really helpful and informative, but when you have a collection of values, we tend to call those value orientations, and I'll mention that several times during my talk. So a value orientation is a collection of values that often reinforce one another, although they certainly don't have to. You can have opposing values and really interesting behaviors and questions pop up when that happens. But value orientations tend to be a cohesive, reinforcing set of values that inform one's behavior, or can inform one's behavior. And they tend to operate along systems of belief as well. And so with that in mind, we will jump into my survey, which looks at spiritual value orientations. And so the motivation behind my study was that as I moved through conservation psychology and through my PhD in ecology, I realized that a lot of the questions around wildlife and whether or not we can protect them successfully, or whether or not we can preserve a natural resource successfully, ultimately ends up being a human question. Oftentimes it's not like what's happening in a population of animals or flora fauna, but how we choose to engage with them that drives outcomes typically. And so I became interested in, well, what ultimately drives people to do what they do. And there's a lot of different answers for that, but I'm explicitly interested in how we relate to nature from a cultural and psychological orientation. And I think spiritual values offer a very good window into that. And so spiritual values over the course of human existence and history have been very important. I have a picture here of cave art from a sacred site in Australia, and the name is escaping me at this moment. I'm very sorry, but this cave art is to illuminate and remind us that before there was even effective language, there was imagery. And this imagery reflected an intimate relationship with nature, to the point of it being almost a spiritual, informative relationship. And not almost, a lot of these early civilizations had shamanism at the center of their cultures. A lot of knowledge about how to interact with the environment came through shamanism, whether it was you're sick and you needed a particular plant, if you had a particular problem or question, meditating in nature was often gone to. And these are reflected in the earliest communications between individuals of the human race. And so with that undercurrent of importance of spiritual values, a lot of conservation psychologists have looked at and explored this idea. A lot of this literature was published in the 70s, and that literature uses language to describe this as the dark green religion, or deep ecology. And these are getting at ideas that nature and the animals and the plants and the landscapes that we live with have emergent properties greater than themselves, right? So there's this idea of nature and animals and landscapes having self-sovereignty and their own ways of being. And people have been very interested in this. Braun Taylor has published a lot of work looking at deep green religion and asking questions about how we can measure this. And so I became interested in this concept, and I noticed that since about the 50s and 60s, there hasn't been a new measurement tool created to explicitly look at spirituality in a nature context. And so I wanted to present something new that could attempt to do that and capture that. So I created a survey that looked at spiritual value orientations and also listed a couple of conservation-based behaviors. And we deployed this through a Qualtrics panel of folks, which is an online platform where people could take my survey. We had 502 respondents take the survey. We targeted 11 counties bordering the Puget Sound. And the counties that we identified were the counties that physically touch the water of the Puget Sound, thinking that these would be the individuals that may have the most opportunity to view orca. And the time frame for this research was collected in March and April 2022. I'm actually going to interrupt myself and ask Clarissa how much time I have left, so I know how to pace myself for the rest of this talk. Sorry to put you on the spot, Clarissa.
You've got about 15 minutes before we'd like to start the question and answer part.
Okay, so I'm going to actually speed through kind of the general context of the survey to get to the interesting part, which are the results. So I will say that from the literature, we pulled from the deep green religion literature. There are some great questions and frameworks already there. We took those and applied those to our survey. Then we also looked at place-based attachment. So this is how people relate to their environment and how they feel about it. There's a great paper from Dr. David Trimbach, who's actually working for Fish and Wildlife here in Washington State. If you get a chance to read that paper, it's really great. It's just explaining how folks connect with place and how that should be at the forefront of our minds when we start thinking about conservation and management. So we added that to our survey. We also talked about and included wildlife value orientations in our survey. So wildlife value orientations fall along a continuum where you have mutualism here on the left, and mutualism focuses primarily on relating to nature in more of an equal footing in terms of valuing nature, whereas domination on the other side of this would be a hierarchical way of valuing nature. So it would be like bugs or things like that wouldn't be as important as, let's say, like cats or dogs, and then humans would exist at the top. And everything in between we call pluralistic, and they end up pulling from both mutualism and domination in really interesting ways. So we included that in our survey to try to capture that. And like I had said earlier, we pulled some conservation-based behaviors around how an individual can engage in behaviors that would protect salmon and orca here in the Puget Sound, so that we can compare between the value orientations and frameworks I had mentioned earlier and try to connect them to how people are making decisions about engaging in those behaviors. We also included some identity theory, which could be interesting later on. And so here is a visual basically of everything that I just said, all of the different components that we included in our survey. These are in relationship to nature reverence or nature spirituality, and we're trying to understand how that mediate or may mediate engagement in conservation-based behaviors. And so please ignore the statistics side. I just wanted to give a brief kind of view at what those items look like. We have here items like, I feel that nature is part of me and I am a part of nature. This would be our nature spiritualism scale. And our orca personhood scale, which looks at orcas. I feel orcas have cognitive awareness. Orcas experience emotions, and the scale at which people answered these were from 1 to 7. So 1 being strongly disagree, 3 being neutral, and then 7 being strongly agree. And I think there's some variation in there where you could have like some neutrality or not as strong feelings about the statements one way or the other. I'm going to skip over this. I will say that we did some really cool statistics to make sure that everything was behaving like it should based on published literature, and we found that it did. Good job for us. Skipping over that. So here's our results. So we found that anthropomorphism actually explains more of the variance in how people choose to engage in protection behaviors toward orca than just nature spiritualism alone, which is very interesting. When we looked at mutualism, we found that mutualism explains more of the variance in our data than nature spiritualism alone. So it seems that mutualism and those mutualistic values tend to explain whether or not people engage in those behaviors towards orca more than nature spiritualism. And then looking at salmon, we found the same pattern, that anthropomorphism seems to be the driving factor in explaining the variance in engaging in conservation-based behaviors. And then mutualism, again, ends up being the item that describes more of the variance for salmon. And then anthropomorphism, again, ends up being the mediating factor towards communities engaging in conservation-based behavior, and mutualism again here. So it tells a very distinct and very clear story that anthropomorphism and mutualism tend to be the deciding or contributing factors towards explaining the variance in our data when engaging in conservation-based behaviors for salmon, orca. And I'm going to stop myself here because I have a feeling that the rest of this in terms of the implications to management will pop out in our questions. And so I'm actually going to turn it over to Clarissa to do that.
Yeah, so if anyone has any questions for Dr. Safiq, you can put it in the Q&A, or if you are on Facebook Live, you can type it into the comments.
Should I stop share, Clarissa? Would that be helpful?
Unless we have to go back and reference it, it might be good to keep it open.
Yeah, totally. I'll move forward actually to get to my last slide in case folks would like to read how I think my results could influence management and policy in the future.
Yeah, I think if people are not ready yet for questions, I think you can go over it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll try to do that quickly. So the takeaway, like I said, was anthropomorphism and mutualism seem to explain more of the variance. And that's great, cool story for a paper, but ultimately what does that mean for the rest of the world? And my answer is that it points to something fundamental, something that's fundamentally changed in the collective as we view nature and wildlife. So this orca, Sk'aliCh'elh-tenaut, birthed a baby orca, I believe it was a boy, back in 2018, and the baby calf passed away, and she carried her calf in a parade of mourning for several days. I think it was longer than a week, clearly showing the grief of a mother who had lost their child. And I believe beforehand, there may not have been as many people who understood and felt that wildlife share fundamental emotions as humans do. And under anthropomorphism, anthropomorphism is the idea that animals share a lot of human characteristics, even to the point that we might be projecting. But I think that my data show that no, we're valuing wildlife in a way that we recognize ourselves in them and them in us. And so that has a lot of really cool implications for, well, what would it mean if we used language to honor the personhood of Chinook salmon and of orca, and what that could mean for asking for policy and regulation towards a more robust future where orca and salmon are prioritized.
Great. So yeah, we've got questions now. People were able to type their questions. First one, what were the conservation behaviors people engaged in?
Yes, so there is a list on the, I believe it's the Washington State DNR website, where it's like you can take the orca and salmon pledge to engage in behaviors that protect salmon. Some of those would be going to a car wash to wash my car so that the runoff doesn't go directly into storm drains. Another one would be I look for salmon safe stickers on my items that I purchase. There are actually, there's a really cool program for salmon safe hops if you like to drink beer. A lot of the breweries have salmon safe hops labeled on there. So choosing to buy items that have that on there. And I'm blanking on the others, but they're items like that. That's something that an individual could do on the day-to-day. I think another one was I choose to take public transit to try to minimize my carbon footprint.
Great. Another question that we have, how do European immigrant views on orcas compare to that of Native Americans? Did you see that in your survey or did you not?
That's a very good question. And that was actually something that I wanted to look at very explicitly in my survey. But because we didn't have enough people taking the survey statistically, I wouldn't be able to say anything meaningful that could get peer reviewed, published. So that's, I think we will both be disappointed in the answer. No, but I think what you're asking about cultural variance in how we prioritize or choose to engage in conservation behaviors with chinook salmon and orca is a significant question and undoubtedly has influence. Thank you.
Are there plans for another one?
For another survey?
Yeah.
Yeah, hopefully. I have to get funding. Yeah, to do this survey.
'Tis the ultimate downfall of science.
Yes.
Got to
yes.
get funding.
Always.
Would you have any specific guidance on techniques for instilling values of conservation in children?
That is a fabulous question. Man, yes, I do. I would ask that folks be very mindful of the language that they use when they talk about animals or wildlife. Using language that affirms their personhood would be really great. I think if you have pets in the household, how you treat your pets says a lot to kids, especially when they observe how to value animals in relationship to humans. And there are actually, depending on the age of your kids, there are many beautiful kids books written by Indigenous authors about actually orca and salmon. I would look for those. I think you could do a Google search and pull up some really wonderful, beautiful books about that as well.
Yeah, I visited Squaxin Island Museum the other month, and they had a great book selection in their gift shop.
Yes, definitely. And that's another thing too, go to zoos and aquariums, and open up conversation, with your kids. How do you feel about seeing animals in here? And just being open to conversation. If they feel sad that animals are, confined and not in nature, talk about it. If they're curious and excited and want to know more about the animals that they're seeing, talk about it, just be kind of openly curious with your kids, with the kids in your life. They don't have to be necessarily your kids, but the kids that you're engaging with. That's a great question.
We've got another one that came in. Can you talk a bit more about anthropomorphism? Does that cover cognition, or is it only in reference to more human-specific traits?
That is a great question. So anthropomorphism, as it's landed in Western science, is the idea that we humans project human characteristics onto things that are not human. So that would be human order cognition, which historically people thought that only humans really feel emotions like sadness or happiness or apathy or things like that. The idea that humans are the only ones who can do higher order functions like mathematical equations or build tools, right? And a lot of this has been debunked in scientific literature and now. But the idea about anthropomorphism, I think, is more centralized for the most recent generation on the question of, well, do animals have emotion? And so if they do, and we see emotions in animals, then we must be projecting them. So that's anthropomorphizing, is making more human-like the object that you're viewing. I hope that answers your question.
Along those lines, we have another question. How do you define person and personhood?
That is an excellent question. And I should be very clear to say that in terms of the law, there are very specific ways in which person and personhood are defined. But I will give you my more intuitive sense from gleaning that literature and admitting that I am not an expert in this, but person can relate to, in the context of law, an entity that can kind of navigate its own choice or being in the world. And so institutions have been granted personhood. So things like big businesses or banks, because the emergent property of the business ends up falling along the lines of like a value orientation or goals and objectives. And in the eyes of the law, a business can be seen as a person. Now, personhood and specifically non-human rights, I think answers kind of that anthropomorphism question of like, well, we're seeing ourselves in nature and in wildlife, and that's true. And so let's go ahead and acknowledge that wildlife who are seen as non-persons, as beings without autonomy, and give them the status of being an autonomous kind of self-guided entity. Yeah,
seems like that'd be a better world for animals if we treated them.
Yeah, and a better world for us ultimately, definitely. Yeah.
And then do you have any recommendations for accessible resources for learning more about this concept and the kind of work that you do?
Yes, that's an excellent question. On the slide that is listed here, there's a series of blog posts by Emily Gambone, and I actually haven't heard their name pronounced out loud, so hopefully I didn't just butcher it. I apologize, Emily, if I did. And the title is Why We Fight for Non-Human Rights. And the blog, I believe, is from the Non-Human Rights organization. They do a lot of work around granting animals personhood and the conversation taking a step further. So if you're curious, especially about the whale's name who's listed here and that journey, this author does an amazing job doing that. Another great resource underneath that is the Sacred Lands Conservancy. So they are an Indigenous-led nonprofit whose work focuses on bringing Tokate home at the moment, but is much broader than that. It's about honoring the self-sovereignty of the beings here in the Salish Sea that we share our homes with. You can go to sacredsea.org. And then in terms of conservation psychology, I actually have a really good book here, and I'm going to reach down, I'm going to grab it. And it's called Total Liberation. I can't see myself, so hopefully you can see the book here. It's called Total.
Blending in with the background.
I apologize. It's called Total Liberation. The Power and Promise of Animal Rights and the Radical Earth Movement, and it's by David Pellow. So if you look at David Pellow's work or anything that he's published, he'll do a really good job about talking about environmental justice, about conservation psychology, and about relating to nature.
How did you get involved in conservation psychology? Did you like go to school specifically wanting to do that, or is it something that you stumbled into?
It was a meandering journey, but I was in the ballpark of conservation psychology. So I grew up here in the Puget Sound, and my mom was really, really great about taking me to aquariums and taking me out to Sunnyside Beach, kind of up in University Place was my favorite place, and Point Defiance is still my favorite park to walk through. And so I had this kind of sense and knowing that I wanted to do something ultimately that gave back to the land that I loved so much and felt so cared for. And in high school, I was just a science nerd, so that I haven't changed much over my 30 years of existence. And I was curious about environmental science. I took some ecology classes that sparked my interest in ecology. I had some really great mentors at Union who gave me a good lead on a grad program at Rutgers. And then I had fabulous mentors at Rutgers who encouraged me to be curious about conservation psychology, although I didn't have the language or the expertise then to put language around it. And then my current boss, David Fulton, at the University of Minnesota, took me on and has given me tremendous support and resource to be able to navigate conservation psychology and engage in this research. So,
Sounds like such a cool journey.
yeah, it's yeah, it's funny. I think there's a saying about how you try to plan your life and then it immediately does something wildly different. And
do you have any advice for those currently pursuing their PhD or their degrees?
Oh man, you will never be led astray by prioritizing your well-being, your mental health, and following what gives you joy, and that you are in a greater community of folks who support your self-discovery and your research, and to remember that as you journey through, and not to be afraid to ask those around you questions or cold email people that you're interested in working with.
Wise words there, everyone. Looks like we got some more questions coming in. Someone said that personhood implies to me that nature would have standing in court to sue against resource use. Mm-hmm. Do you see progress in this area?
Great question. I do. There are other countries outside of the US who have taken on granting personhood to landscapes. I'm thinking of New Zealand. New Zealand gave personhood to a river. And the way that that manifests in court is there is a council of people who represent the river and the river's interests. So this includes nonprofits who are focused on conservation of that river. There are indigenous folks who speak on behalf of that river. There are folks who use the river, I think, the dam agencies that give power through hydroelectric and use that river are also on this council. And so you have a myriad of individuals who are in relationship to the river, opening themselves up to conversation with each other, but also to how the river seems to be doing in the greater context. And so when they end up going to court, either to address something against the river or against an individual, it ends up being a collective emergent conversation as opposed to just one person speaking on behalf of this river.
That's pretty amazing to see.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully the US adopts that someday.
That would be great. I'm biased, clearly. But personally, I think that'd be really great.
And then we have another question. Mm-hmm. What about the controversy of Lolita in Florida, for which SeaWorld doesn't want to return her to the polluted Puget Sound?
That's a really great question. So it's a conversation, right? And I think ultimately both parties want what is best for Lolita. I would argue that her life's legacy of being taken out of the Puget Sound and away from her family demands reparation from Miami Sea Aquarium or from the organizations that had a hand in her being taken away from her natal waters. And what those reparations are open to conversation. And I'm actually not as up to date on that. But I will say that sacredsea.org has their finger on the pulse with this. So if you want to know how that's progressing, you can go there and get updates. In terms of returning her to the polluted Puget Sound, Puget Sound, I would have to look at the habitat recovery and coastal plan, but it's historically not nearly as polluted as it has been in the past. And also that Lolita in terms of being reintroduced through marine sanctuary actually has a pretty good probability of surviving, because orca, like I said, they have the lifespan of a human. They also have the memory of a human, if not better, to be honest with you. And she will remember her mother, her pod, and her mother remember her. And so even if the waters are polluted or salmon aren't in as abundant numbers as we would like them to be here in Washington, there might be some healing that could occur from returning Lolita from her isolated enclosure back to her family. But it's absolutely a conversation.
They do like the idea of the Lummi being her caretaker, but
definitely, they've done incredible work.
And then someone was a bit confused over the use of the word personhood. Could you provide another sort of definition or description?
Sure. I will have to think. Sometimes I'm like this, where it's helpful to see the opposite and kind of work backwards. And so I'm trying to think of what the opposite of personhood would be. Personhood, I'm going to try to talk my way through this and hopefully not talk in circles. Again, is the kind of the idea that you are granted or give something self-autonomy. So they are an entity who can move on behalf of themselves, articulate on behalf of themselves, kind of direct their fate and their future, and have an opinion on kind of day-to-day goings, whereas non-personhood would be sort of a value orientation in which something doesn't have autonomy or doesn't have the capacity to kind of move in a way that would cue the environment or the culture around them to see them as a being, kind of like you and I. Hope that gets at that a little bit more. I'm sorry that I can't give a better explanation, but hopefully that gets at that a little bit.
I think that was a good other view of it.
Thanks.
So like if you had a tree and you chopped it down and that tree didn't have personhood, like nothing happens. But if that tree had personhood and someone went to go chop it down, then there's the issue there, right? The tree has say that like, oh no, this is a good thing to have here. We shouldn't take that tree down.
Definitely. And the idea that the tree has its own treeness, right? Like that tree belongs in and unto itself and can exist in the world. Whereas if it didn't have personhood, perhaps it would be seen as just object for taking, presuming that we as society only take or use objects that can't, advocate on behalf of themselves, because they're not people, they're not persons. They can't advocate on behalf of themselves and engage in that kind of order of relating or being.
I hope that helped anyone who is struggling with that sort of technical term. If you're not into the science, sometimes these terms can be like, well, that's just a normal word that people use. They talk about person and personhood, but in the scientific context, we get a lot more specific. Another question, how can we better get all three major limiting factors addressed for our southern resident killer whales management?
That is a very good question. So the three, to remind myself and everybody else in case I forgot, would be boat noise, prey availability, so salmon populations need to come back, and pollutants in the environment. And so each of those things in and of themselves are very nuanced, very complex kind of subfields, or even could exist in and of themselves. So in terms of contamination, I think being aware of politicians or folks who are actively working on how industries dispose of their contaminants or dispose of the byproducts of whatever it is they're producing, and being supportive of responsible like disposal of contaminants to make sure that it doesn't enter the sound is one way to mitigate that. Also the use of fertilizers on lawns and things, being mindful about runoff and what you put on your lawn, or what washes out or from your car can directly enter the Puget Sound through waterways. Storm drain, there we go, storm drain like runoff. So being mindful about that, doing what you can. I will also say that a lot of this, it's good to think about the individual and individual actions, but this also scales to society level, right? So we need businesses and industry to get alongside all of these things. So if you're engaged in politics and you vote, thinking about how your vote or how your politicians are orienting themselves towards relating to orca conservation and chinook conservation would be good. Salmon recovery, supporting folks who work on removing the dams along the Snake River, I think would be a great way of making sure that salmon have the habitat that they need to reproduce and get more salmon into the population, right? More habitat means more salmon. And then, oh, the bio noise issue, that's very interesting. Again, I would kind of punt that to looking at politicians who take a stance on mitigating boat noise in a way that aligns with your values. You know, I won't, what I don't want folks to walk away from the talk and say, oh, like Alex, that's money boats like out on the water. No, that's not true. I want mindful recreation in a way that creates space for everybody, including orca. So yeah, that can look like a lot of different ways. I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Safiq, for presenting your survey results for us and talking more about the relationship between our orcas and salmon and what we can do to help them.
Sure.
Thank you to everyone who joined our Zoom or is watching on Facebook Live. I hope this talk has sparked your interest in to learn more and start those conversations with your friends and family. Remember that if you did your coloring, you can tag us on Facebook or Instagram and share your colorings that you've done. Our next one will be on November 3rd. Keep a lookout on our website and our social media for when we announce who will be our next speaker. If you do want to learn more about our orcas and salmon and the relationship, we do have an exhibit at the estuarium right now talking about our southern resident orcas and why they are sadly not doing well in Puget Sound. And then we will also have salmon docents out in November, the first 2 weekends at Bayshore Preserve, where we'll see the chum salmon coming up Johns Creek, and we'll have the docents out there to help answer any questions about the salmon that you have. If you have any other questions for Dr. Safiq, you can email us, or she provided her contact information, so you can always send her any more questions that you have. Thanks again, Dr. Safiq. I really enjoyed listening to your presentation and knowing that people are caring more about orcas now, and hopefully we can keep up and know that that's the way to get more conservation happening.
Definitely. Thank you for having me.
I hope everyone has a good rest of your night, and sorry we went slightly over time.